there is muted except for the presenters and will remain muted. We're going to do questions by you emailing them to me, and I will then pass them along to the presenters. The place to send your questions is webinar@synapse-energy.com. Go ahead and send your questions there. I'll keep my eye on it, pass those along to the presenters during the question and answer period. If you have a technical issue, then what you want to do with that is to work with the chat feature on WebEx, and our technical person will take a look at those and try to solve them for you in real time. So those are the basic logistics, and here we go. So our two speakers have both been spending the last 2 days deeply entrenched in the new rule, and the last months and years looking at the precursors to the rule and the proposed rule. Our first speaker is Ari Pesco. He's an Energy Law Fellow at the Harvard Environmental Policy Initiative, and that's a policy shop that provides real-time, real-world legal analysis of front-page energy and environmental issues. Ari has written extensively about electricity regulation and we're having technical difficulties, I'm being told, so I'll continue in a moment. Yes, my screen certainly just went dead. Hey everybody, if you can still hear me out there, there's some sort of technical difficulty going on that is being solved. So let's just take a pause and, how are we doing?
We're going to pass control to Art. Keep going.
Keep going? Okay. So as we're waiting for the screen to come up, I'll finish my introductions of Ari and Jeremy. Ari's been spending a lot of his time looking at the proposed and final rule and is coming to this from a legal perspective. We also have with us Dr. Jeremy Fisher of Synapse, and he has a background in global ecosystem modeling and climate impact analysis and science with energy system planning and analysis, and he's been doing a lot of work on the rule. He provides his expertise to EPA, to state regulators, and to advocates as well. And Jeremy has also been very deeply entrenched in learning about this final rule. So with those two different perspectives, I think that we have a lot to offer this afternoon. And we're going to start out with Ari speaking. Hopefully everybody's screens came back. I know mine did. And you should be seeing a screen that says Webinar Logistics right now. And I'm going to turn it over to Ari.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to Synapse for organizing this. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. So I'm going to start out just by talking about what happened on Monday. EPA released a lot of PDF files, so I'm just going to give a quick overview of everything that came out, and then I'm going to talk about the one key change in the rule and give you just a legal perspective on why I think that makes this, the big change is going to make this rule more legally defensible than the proposal was. So, of course, the first thing that came out was the Clean Power Plan itself, and that's the topic that we'll be delving into today. You may have heard that the proposal is, or the final rule rather, is 1,560 pages. The way that breaks down is most of it is the preamble, which is supposed to inform non-expert readers about the basics of what the plan is, and the last 100 pages or so is the regulation itself. That is what will be in the Code of Federal Regulations. EPA also came out with a proposed federal plan and proposed model rules for states to use in their own plans. Again, these are just proposals. EPA will take comment on them and expects to finalize them next summer. So we'll talk about those a little bit as we move on here. The third thing is carbon pollution standards for new, modified, and reconstructed power plants. This is a final rule. It sets performance standards for new coal-fired power plants of 1,400 pounds per megawatt hour, and also sets performance standards of 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour for new natural gas turbines. Regulatory impact analyses, these are basically cost-benefit analyses of the rules that I mentioned. Technical support documents are just that. They go into further technical detail, particularly on some of the calculations that are in this rule that Jeremy is going to talk about. So there are a number of those that have been released, including additional ones just last evening or early this morning. And then there's a draft evaluation, measurement, and verification guide. This is for energy efficiency, and we may talk a little bit about this as well. This is not a regulatory document, but it is sort of guidance on best practices for how states can approach energy efficiency to the extent they plan on using that as a compliance mechanism. So the big change in the final rule as compared to the proposal, the final rule is premised on national uniform unit-specific performance rates, as opposed to the proposal, which was based on state targets. So this change brings the rule into line with long-established EPA precedent, where EPA typically tailors emission rates to different types of technology. The final rule does also still include state goals, but those state goals are based on these national uniform unit-specific performance rates. And so I think this change is motivated in part by EPA looking to shore up the legality of this rule. So let me explain why, over the next few slides, why this change I think is going to be critical to EPA's legal defense of the rule. So first, just a little bit of background about the Clean Air Act, and this is my only slide about the Clean Air Act, so we can just hopefully get through this one and then move on to the rule itself and more interesting things. But the key section here is Section 111. Under 111, EPA sets standards of performance for source categories. So a source category is typically different types of industrial facilities like Portland cement plants or sulfuric acid plants or lead smelters. And this section of the Clean Air Act, Section 111, is typically used to set performance standards for new sources. That is, before a facility is built, the owner goes to EPA and gets a permit that commits the facility to certain emission standards. Usually these standards are expressed as a rate, not a mass limit. And the standard of performance is typically based on pollution capture technologies or high-efficiency equipment that should be used at the facility. So EPA has dozens of new source performance standards. Those are Section 111B, and those include the new standards for coal-fired and natural gas plants that I mentioned a minute ago. So 111D is the section for existing sources, and this section has rarely been used because many existing sources are regulated under other sections of the Act. But what this section says, if you look at the second bullet on the slide, each state shall submit a plan to EPA that establishes standards of performance for any existing source to which a standard would apply if that source were a new source. So 2 points here. First, the new source standard for coal-fired and natural gas plants is critical because EPA can't set a standard for existing sources without a standard for new sources. So it's critical that that new source standard hold up in court as well. And the second thing is that this 111D section really puts states in charge of the process. They're the ones that are submitting plans. Now, the key language in this 111 section is a standard of performance, and you have part of the definition there in the third bullet point, and sort of the term that people have been talking about is the best system of emission reduction. Clearly, it's sort of an open-ended term, an invitation for EPA to figure out what that means for each particular type of source. And critically, there are no court decisions about 111D standards, so EPA is really operating in some new and open territory here. So what EPA did back in June of last year was it defined this best system of emission reduction to mean 4 things. The critical difference, though, between the proposal and the final is that BESR, or BESR, depending on how you want to pronounce it, maybe it's a regional thing, in the proposal, it applied to each state's entire fleet of generators. And so EPA looked at 4 different things that states could do: heat rate improvements at the coal plants, shifting utilization from coal to natural gas, displacing generation with renewables, and increasing end-use energy efficiency. These were the 4 components of BESR applied to each state. And what you were left with was this. This was sort of the output of the proposal. Each state had its own state target. And, what you can see from the colors on this map is that state targets varied widely. So, there was no uniformity in it. And again, this is based on a look at an entire, sort of an agglomeration of what's happening in an entire state. So there were several legal and practical critiques of this approach. So first, as I've mentioned, basing state goals on an entire fleet of generators was inconsistent with the Clean Air Act's focus on regulation of sources, and also inconsistent with past practice where EPA had set nationally uniform sources. So that was sort of a legal critique. Practically, state-by-state goals could be inconsistent with the interstate nature of the grid. So people had raised a lot of practical issues about how each state can comply, given that the energy is moving in and out of states freely. Secondly, EPA in its proposal had envisioned non-emitters being critical actors here, and even being able to take enforcement action against non-emitting entities, for example, distribution companies that might have had renewable energy obligations. So there were some legal questions about EPA's authority over these non-emitters. And the practical question here was, if EPA has a relationship with these distribution companies, with these non-emitting entities, is that somehow intruding into traditional state regulatory functions? And people raised a lot of practical questions about how those sorts of relationships would evolve. A third critique was building block 4, that was end-use energy efficiency. The legal argument here was that there's sort of no limiting principle to what EPA can do if they're allowed to be regulating the use of energy. I actually had co-authored a paper making a legal case for why it was okay for them to do that. But nonetheless, there were a lot of arguments made that EPA was now sort of reaching into every home in America. And, even if you didn't buy that argument, I think it would have looked pretty good in a brief from those who are opposed to the rule. The practical problem with building block 4 was, maybe it made sense for the electricity industry because it's so interconnected, you could make that argument, but what about other industries that potentially could have a 111D regulation down the line? Would EPA then, attempt to regulate the use of all different types of commodities? And the last thing is timing. EPA initially had set a compliance period starting in 2020. The legal problem there was that states may have to pass laws. Not all state legislatures meet every year, and so there could have been some problems there, and then some difficulties in getting sufficient regulations passed in time. And the practical problem with the timing issue is just, there may be some infrastructure that needs to be constructed here, and so can we do that by 2020? So I think EPA addressed a lot of these in the final rule. So, first of all, with regard to the state goals, as Jeremy is going to provide more detail on, EPA set uniform emission guidelines for fossil steam units, which is coal units and oil and gas units, and for natural gas combined cycle units. EPA largely got rid of the non-emitters in this. EGUs are now the only entities with federally enforceable requirements. Although EPA has still, as Jeremy will get into, offered a range of different state plan options, so states still have flexibility, but non-emitting entities are no longer going to be coming under EPU's direct enforcement authority. And EPA got rid of that block 4 when they figure the best system of emission reduction. So energy efficiency is still in as a compliance mechanism. It's primarily going to be a credit-generating mechanism, I think, and it's no longer part of the sort of goal-setting methodology. So the first 3 bullets here are really getting at focusing on the unit itself, not states, and that, I think, really makes this look a lot more like a traditional Clean Air Act regulation as compared to the proposal, which did raise some more difficult legal questions. And finally, they've pushed the compliance date out to 2022. I think, as a legal matter, I think it'll be a lot harder for states to argue they don't have enough time to be, promulgating necessary regulations or pushing through necessary legislation at the state level. And I think practically that does give people more time to do the permitting and the construction of whatever infrastructure may be necessary to meet these goals. And one other point about this timing, and maybe we'll talk about it at the end later, is the first sort of legal battle here is going to be about whether or not this regulation gets stayed, that is, whether or not it sort of gets held into place gets sort of held to the sidelines while the court battles about the legality of the rule play out. But because there are no obligations on anyone until 2022, I think it makes it that much more difficult for opponents of this rule to argue that they're going to really suffer any sort of injury, because there's fewer commitments that are going to need to be made as this makes its way through the court system. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeremy, who's going to go into a lot more detail about what this rule says.
Thank you, Ari, and welcome. And just a brief reminder to those of you that if you have questions for us on content-related issues, please feel free to send it to the email that you see on your screen right now, webinar@synapseenergy.com. So I'm going to pick off where Ari left off into what EPA has actually done with this new final rule and walk a little through how the final differs from the proposal in terms of its practical implications both for individual states and what it actually means for the target setting mechanism and compliance options, because there are some ways in which it looks fairly similar to the proposed rule, and there are other ways in which it really does have quite a few differences. So we're on a page right now where I'm going to show the basic equation for the proposed 111D emission rate and compare that to the way that EPA came up with these final rates. And this is filled with a lot of equations, or at least proto-equations, but there are some fundamental things that I want to draw your attention to. So up at the top of this screen, you see where it says proposed 111D emissions rate. We have the proposal mechanism that was used to set the rate of each individual state. And EPA went through the 4 building blocks that you probably well remember to look at baseline fossil fuel emissions and baseline fossil fuel generation from oil, natural gas, and coal. Do some adjustments to those with building block 1, and then effectively added to the denominator nuclear generation, renewable generation, and anticipated energy efficiency. And between those elements, we had building block 1, again, changing the efficiency of individual coal units or of the coal unit fleet as a whole. Building block 2, changing the dispatch between natural gas and coal, and building blocks 3 and 4, adding in energy efficiency and renewable energy and nuclear generation, actually inverse respectively. And those were used to set up the building blocks for each individual state were used to come up with targets for each individual state. For the final, EPA has taken a completely different approach. We actually don't have specific state targets at the forefront. What we actually have instead are subcategory uniform emissions rates that are sort of similar in nature to new source performance standards, at least conceptually, for fossil steam units. So that's both oil, gas, steam, and coal steam, and then emissions rates for natural gas combined cycle units. And starting off with actually the emissions rates for the natural gas combined cycle units down at the bottom here, what we end up having is just a fairly straightforward calculation where EPA takes in each of the 3 major interconnections, the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and ERCOT. They separately look at natural gas emissions from all units in each of those interconnections, generation from all of the units in those interconnections again, and then effectively add renewable generation to the denominator there and come up with a final BESSER emissions rate for natural gas combined cycle units with some adjustments to states that had either different hydro years or specific changes in their elements. They do that for all three interconnections, and then they're going to compare those three and choose one of them, the least stringent of them, which actually changes between the Eastern Interconnection and ERCOT, depending on the year. Then we're going to go up to the middle section here, looking at the steam fossil emissions rate. And that one is set a little bit more complicatedly, and there are parts of it that we can't quite explain yet, but we're working around to it. And what EPA has done here is they've applied building block 1 as per normal to coal steam. So we reduce the relative amount of emissions that we expect out of our system, or actually hold those emissions while we change the amount of generation. And then in the numerator and the denominator, we're going to add in the incremental amount of emissions that we have from NGCCs that now dispatch at 75% capacity factor instead of what they were doing in 2012. And again, it's not entirely clear what the justification is for doing that. We've been trying to parse that over the last 24 hours, and hopefully we'll have a better answer by the next webinar. But we add natural gas incremental emissions and generation to the numerator and the denominator, and then also add renewable energy generation to the denominator, the equivalent of building block 3. Notice we no longer have nuclear generation included here, and we also no longer have energy efficiency in that denominator. And so that leaves us with a fossil steam emissions rate. Now what EPA can do is take those two different emissions rates and apply them ratably to each state's 2012 generation from the fossil steam subcategory and to natural gas combined cycle units subcategory. And by applying those ratably, they can come up with estimated targets, or actually very specific targets, in both rate terms and then ultimately in mass terms for each of the states. And I'm going to now flip over to what those mass targets look like. Also different from the proposed rule, we have both rate targets as in the proposed rule set for each state, but we also now have firm mass targets. And we have two forms of firm mass targets. We have mass targets that include only the existing generators that are affected sources, and we have a new form of mass target. We have mass target that explicitly includes new generators, and EPA is calling these the new source complement targets. And so states, as you'll see, will actually have the option of choosing whether they're only going to apply their mass-based targets if they take a mass-based direction to their existing units, or whether they're going to take the other target and apply it to their overall system, including new units. So we're going to go back to the proposal for a moment here, and effectively what we're looking at here are the equivalent of mass-based reductions from EPA's adjusted 2012 baseline emissions to the 2030 target in the rate to mass TSD in the proposed rule. And one of the things that Ari was pointing out earlier is it's really a patchwork. And that was actually one of the state complaints coming into this, is that states that were adjacent really had very diverse and disparate targets from each other that might have been based on the amount of renewable energy generation that was in those states, or just their coal-gas mix, or other different factors that changed the way the equation was ultimately applied to those states. But we had states that had as much as a 50% reduction from 2012 required by 2030, and states that had close to a zero, and in some cases actually even a slight positive increase that was allowed under the system. Under the final, we have generally actually a less stringent target. We have a much smoother gradation across states, and this is widely due to both the regionalization mechanism that EPA has used, of taking large, broad-scale renewable energy targets and applying those to subcategory emission rates, and then applying those to the states prorated on a ratable basis. and that's generally how we've ended up with this smoother gradation over the states in terms of the stringency of targets. Rather than having patchwork, the upper Midwest and part of the West now have the more stringent requirements, but some states have changed fairly significantly under this. So again, this is the change from 2012 to 2030, and where it says without complements refers to, it does not include the new source complement target. So this is just the target that's required for existing sources. It looks slightly different if you include EPA's assumption about load growth that then gets you new source complements on top. Comparing those two to each other, who's changed? In this graph, blue states, or states that are colored in different shades of blue, have had their targets made less stringent, and in some cases significantly so. And states that are orange have had their targets made more stringent. And so you see that there are some states across the Midwest and through the Upper West that have slightly more significant targets, up to much more significant targets, depending on how the equation ultimately hit. But largely, targets aren't actually too massively substantially different on a national scale. They are less stringent, but amazingly, even though this different math is being used, we're still coming up with targets that look not dissimilar. On a national basis, just sort of give the total summary number, in the proposal, EPA was effectively proposing to reduce emissions by about 700 million tons, so a 34% reduction from 2012. And I apologize, that doesn't say from 2012 here. And in the final, that's now been made a little bit less stringent, down to just under 600 million tons worth of reduction, or a 26% fall. When taking into account both existing and new sources, the final is actually a little bit more stringent than the proposal, requiring reduction of 547 million tons or 550 million tons or so, which basically says that ultimately the new source complements don't actually net much of a reduction for states to choose to use that direction. States now have a large variety of compliance pathways. Whereas previously we had two major compliance routes, excuse me, and a couple of other proposed compliance routes, states could previously either take a rate-based measure or a mass-based route. Under both the rate-based route and the mass-based route, we now have a couple of different options, and they have different requirements and different outcomes for each one. Over here on the left side, we have three different versions of rate-based compliance. And again, starting off with EPA's definition of these subcategorized emissions rates. This is emissions rates specifically for existing gas and GCCs and existing fossil steam units. There's this interesting thing that EPA has now put out that wasn't previously available. States could choose to just assign their existing fossil units a specific subcategorized rate assigned to them by EPA and forget about the state target altogether. And that makes it easily consistent across states. Those rate targets then become fully consistent, but it's a completely different mechanism than we've seen previously. Under R2, R2 over here with the state CO2 emissions rates, that's actually quite similar to what we would have seen as the rate-based system under the proposed rule. This is where each state then takes its allocated, prorated state average emissions rate rather than a subcategorized emissions rate. And so under this compliance option, every unit in the state is assigned a limit of that of the state's particular emissions rate. Now, there's something that's particularly important about this that doesn't actually make it into the text over here. But both this R1 and R2, and actually most of the mass-based mechanisms that we're about to show in just a moment, are actually emission standards approaches. This means that EPA requires that states give each EGU a federally enforceable limit that gets written into their permits. And that wasn't necessarily going to be the case in the proposal. The proposal offered the opportunity of doing portfolio approaches and some hybridized approaches that didn't necessarily require that states give each EGU a specific permitted limit. The last of the rate-based compliance options is where states choose their own CO2 emissions rates to give to each individual unit. There might be different utilities or different EGUs out there that have a particular interest in having emissions rates that are different than either the subcategorized emissions rate or the state emissions rate. And there might be a reasonable reason for a state to choose their own customized emissions rates for the permitting of their units. But if they're going to go down that road, EPA has a couple of additional requirements for those states. Those states need to prove that they're going to continue to hit their average state emissions rate over time, and they need to prove it through a fairly definitive performance guideline and demonstration at the forefront. And so it adds a burden for states who want to go down that road, but it does give some flexibility. For states that choose a mass-based compliance route, EPA identifies 3 different routes. We're parsing it into 4 since it's worthwhile calling them out on the floor. And these are all the equivalent of, well, they're mostly the equivalent of mass-based trading that you would be familiar with some interesting twists. So M1 and M2 here are mass-based goals for both existing units and then M2 for existing units with that new unit complement, new source complement. So that would be regulating both your new units and your existing units, although the regulatory structure for regulating your new units is slightly different than regulating your existing units. But that's the case in which you'd have a different target for your state if you're including both of those. So you can choose either the existing unit route or the existing and new unit complement under M2, or you can go this other route, which is the state measures approach. The state measures approach allows states to take non-federally enforceable actions that they think will reduce their mass-based requirements and apply those to their state. If they choose to go that route, EPA has a couple of additional requirements that they put in play. They require both a performance demonstration and they also require a fairly regular checkup with a backstop provision such that states can't fail, or hopefully can't fail, to actually meet their requirements. Otherwise, EPA's model rule steps in. And finally, there's a version of the same in which there's a mass-based goal for both new and existing units, but takes the state measures approach. In both rate-based compliance and mass-based compliance, EPA has offered model rules, and they've implied, if not outright said within the final rule, that if you're going to use a backstop, they recommend relying on their model rule. And they even recommend just going ahead and taking the model rule because I think it's going to be the thing that works. I'm going to dive for a little bit into emissions rate credits. Emissions rate credits are the unit of trade for rate-based states. And these are a new entity that we haven't seen previously. We thought that something like this might ultimately exist, but this takes a slightly different form than I think many parties were necessarily thinking of. These are rate-traded items that are produced in megawatt hours. So whereas you might normally be familiar with trading allowances in tons, in mass-based states, rate-based states will be trading in megawatt-hour ERCs. Very specifically, these are not RECs. They can overlap with RECs. They might be based on the same types of programs that are also producing RECs. And as far as I can tell, a program can both produce a REC and an ERC. They're separate and separable programs. They're similar in their structure to unbundled RECs because they can be traded across states that have ERC trading structures freely. and the EPA is quite open to that and actually anticipates that being the case. Emissions rates credits are generated for low and no emissions resources, so our renewable energy options, and we'll get around to exactly which resources are okay for the production of ERCs. And for those no emissions resources, effectively they produce an ERC for every megawatt hour of generation they produce. They can also be produced for affected unit generation. So these are our covered sources that are below their subcategory rate. So if I have a natural gas unit that produces at a native emissions rate that is below EPA's requirement for natural gas units, I'll actually be producing a moderate number of ERCs from that can be sold into the market. Now, there are limitations on how those specific ERCs get used, but those do produce ERCs. And then, in addition, EPA has opened this opportunity for natural gas combined cycle units that are producing above their 2012 baseline amount to also produce ERCs to the extent that they're producing at a low emissions rate. So there are a couple of different pieces of guidance that they produce in the model rule as to how these, quote, gas shift ERCs are produced. That one's going to require a lot more explanation further downstream. Emissions rates credits are generated for resources that are installed in 2013 or after, but they only accrue after 2022. So we can start building stuff now. We could have even started building stuff in the last 2 years, but we're not going to get credit for it until 2022, with the exception of an early action program that we can talk about during question and answer that's limited in its size, but it's available for states acting after 2018 and before 2022. ERCs can be banked indefinitely, and as I noted a moment ago, those gas shift ERCs can really only be used for fossil steam compliance, and we can talk a little bit more about that during questions if there are questions. ERCs can be issued to a bunch of different low or no emitting resources, and EPA is pretty careful to qualify when these can get used. Again, these are only resources that are in play 2013 or thereafter. If your resource was built prior to 2013, it's out of the program altogether. Renewable energy programs, the traditional wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, wave, tidal, all produce ERCs as long as they're grid connected. Qualified biomass, EPA has some fairly rigorous guidance that they're trying to put together in terms of what available biomass is that can be used for ERC generation. The biogenic portion of waste-to-energy projects, and interestingly, all nuclear constructed after 2013. So that's going to include Summer and Watts Bar and Vogel, for example, will probably all be producing ERCs as they come online, or at least after 2022. CHP units, combined heat and power units that are not affected. Of course, we were looking for it for a while, but energy efficiency and other demand-side management programs that avoid megawatt hours of generation are fully applicable for ERCs. EPA does have a fairly rigorous monitoring and verifications program that they ask states to engage in order to be able to qualify those ERCs. And then finally, transmission and distribution improvements that save generation at the end source. Not quite clear exactly what's required in order to be able to make those applicable, but those can get used as well. ERCs at this point are explicitly not available for energy storage and new stationary sources. And finally, there's this last little piece in here about ERCs, which you can imagine there would be a question of if a mass-based state were pursuing their own mechanism of reducing their own emissions via energy efficiency and renewable energy programs in the mass-based state, you wouldn't want them to also get credit for those same programs in a rate-based state by selling ERCs. So EPA has pretty much said, hands down, mass-based states cannot sell ERCs. So if you're a renewable energy generator within a mass-based state, you're not selling ERCs unless you have a power purchase agreement or fixed contract with a rate-based state entity, which is going to get very interesting to try to track who's doing what, and certainly changes the incentives as to who wants to be mass-based state and who wants to be a rate-based state. I'm going to spend just a couple moments on trading mechanisms. There are a couple of different trading mechanisms that are now being set up. A lot of these we're already familiar with, but they're now getting formalized. EPA has opened formally to mass-based trading. This would be an allowance-based trading system, probably similar to traditional cap-and-trade. EPA allows states to establish their own allowance allocation system and even their own tracking system. Both of those are subject to EPA's approval. As we were just talking about ERCs, those ERCs can either be used by the same entity that produces them. So if I'm a vertically integrated utility and I build a renewable energy project, I can use my own ERCs within my own system without having to go through a trading system. Or I can sell them on a bilateral market, or I can sell them on a state-based market system, or multiple states might choose to get together and create a clearinghouse of ERCs. Finally, there's rate-based trading, which is this sort of elusive piece about how different states might engage it's sort of the equivalent of mass-based trading, but it's trading between EGUs who are affected and trading on tons per megawatt hour basis. And EPA has said, yeah, you're welcome to get yourself going down this road, but you either need to all be on the subcategory specific emissions rate plan, or you need to adopt a common rate standard, as in you need to adopt a multi-state plan. No other option, no other rate-based trading. Again, states can establish that crediting system, and it's subject to EPA's approval. There are a couple of ways that EPA has addressed multi-state issues, but as Ari was talking about, largely the mechanisms that they've put in play have mitigated to some extent some of the biggest multi-state issues and leakage issues that might have been present in the proposal. First, states are welcome to submit multi-state plans. And from a mass-based perspective, it's simply you aggregate up your CO2 targets, call it a day. For rate-based plans, states need to take their rates, multiply it by their 2012 generation. That gives them their weighted average emissions rate. Done. The advantage of doing so, at least in rate-based states, is that it facilitates rate-based trading and assures this uniform treatment of ERCs. But really, ultimately, it's not quite as critical under the final as in the proposal, because EPA has set up these mechanisms by which states can effectively trade with each other without necessarily needing a multi-state plan specifically. EPA does get very into the weeds on leakage about existing sources and new sources. They don't want to end up in a situation in which existing sources cease generating and new sources just get built in their stead and pick up the same generation and emissions. So for states that are going to regulate mass for their existing sources only, EPA is pretty clear that those need to have specific demonstrations of no leakage, or they need to use this funky allowance allocation scheme that EPA has put forward that they think will mitigate this leakage issue itself. Overall, EPA is a little bit less concerned about the leakage across state lines of ERCs between mass and rate-based states, and it's really just this PPA provision that I was referring to earlier that could prevent that from happening. Finally, just briefly, there are multiple things that need to go into state plans, but sort of the critical key pieces outside of the legal framework for what states need to actually do are these sort of couple of core components, and they change depending on what type of compliance plan states are pursuing. First, if you're in a rate-based plan that's going to allow ERCs, and that's all of them, then you need a evaluation, monitoring, and verification plan. And that's the mechanism that you're going to use to make sure that your renewable energy, your energy efficiency, and even your ERCs that are generated from your existing sources, like your natural gas combined cycle units, are appropriately captured, reported, and verified. For states that are pursuing the state measures plan, and again, this is now sort of on the outside, it's not what EPA necessarily considers the standard, these are the M3 or M4, there needs to be a projection that the plan will actually achieve its goal. Also, if you're under the circumstance where you've chosen different rate-based targets for your units than EPA's subcategory standard or the state-based target. EPA also wants a projection that the plan is going to achieve the goal. But for almost all other plans, no projection is required explicitly. If you're in a mass-based plan that has the possibility of only covering your existing sources and you're not taking the new source complement target and covering your new sources as well, EPA wants a demonstration that you're going to be able to address your leakage from your old sources to your new sources. And finally, if you're taking a state measures plan, EPA is going to demand a backstop that triggers if you fail to hit your target. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Ari. And please remember to send your questions as you've got them over to webinar@synapse-energy.com.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to close by talking about some additional timing issues and some other submissions in addition to the final plans that states are going to be making over the next few years, and then just very briefly talk about the federal plan and the model rules. So first, the compliance period, as I mentioned, it's pushed back to 2022 in the final rule. And so there's this interim period of 2022 to 2029. EPA has divided that into 3 steps, and they're requiring that EGUs meet targets for each step. So it's sort of a glide path between 2022 and 2030. States don't have to include these 3 specific timelines in their plans. They can modify them, but this is what EPA has proposed that states do, and so that would certainly be the easiest path forward. The final period is it's a 2-year performance period, 2030 and 2031, and states are going to have to submit compliance reports after each step. So this is the timeline of what it is states are going to be submitting between now and 2032. And I'll briefly talk about the 2016 and the 2017 submissions. And as I mentioned, there are sort of compliance reports along the way. There's one additional compliance report if the state opts for the state measures approach. So that does, add just one additional relatively small hurdle there for that state measures option. That would be in 2023. Just as the program's sort of getting underway, you have to do an initial report back to EPA about it. So that 2016 submission, so this is, I think, going to be interesting because this is what's going to be happening in each state over the next 1 year. This is due September of 2016. So EPA argues that this initial submission is going to be helpful for 2 reasons. First, it's going to make the process more transparent for states. So states are going to have an opportunity to understand what approaches other states are considering. So maybe this will lead to states thinking together on some of these issues, maybe even deciding to join together in certain ways. It's also transparent for EPA. It provides EPA with opportunity to provide feedback to make sure that, states may very well do innovative things that EPA has not exactly considered. And so, just to be able to sort of provide guidance to make sure that everything can be approvable. So that's the first thing that states need to include in this initial submission is just the approaches that are being considered, and they don't seem to have to be too detailed on that. The second thing states have to include is to justify why they need additional time. In other words, why can't they submit a complete final plan by 2016? So EPA has said that some appropriate sort of reasons for why states might need extra time. It could be it needs legislative approval, or there may have to be administrative rulemakings that have to happen. It could be hoping for additional coordination with other states. This is not an exhaustive list. There could be any number of additional reasons that might be okay for why it needs additional time. And the third piece is to describe the public comment and engagement opportunities that have already happened in the state. So that's it. Those are the 3 things that a state has to submit if it wants to participate in this early credit incentive program, which we can get into later. It has to include a non-binding statement about that as well. And so EPA has promised to respond very quickly, 90 days, or actually they say in one place 60, another place 90. So I'd have to sort of parse through what the difference is exactly between those two dates. But 60 to 90 days, EPA is gonna get back. And so it seems that failure to submit anything in 2016 is going to trigger the fifth process, that is the federal plan process. And the way that's going to play out is that if a state does not submit something, then it seems like EPA will sort of make a determination within 60 or 90 days. And then after that, EPA has 12 months where it can promulgate a federal plan. So, that would bring you out to sometime sort of late, 2017 perhaps, when EPA would have to promulgate a federal plan. But, keep in mind the compliance date isn't until 2022. So a state could decide subsequently to then submit its own state plan, even if EPA does promulgate that federal plan. So the 2017 report, this is just sort of a check-in report. It does have to commit to a plan approach, so that's sort of a key item that has to be decided by 2017. Are you going with a rate-based approach? Are you going with a mass-based approach? Are you going to be formally joining with other states in some sort of multi-state plan? So it has to be, that's a critical deadline there. It has to include a roadmap with a schedule and various milestones. And again, if you are intent on joining that early credit program, it has to include a non-binding statement on that. And EPA is also looking for, at this point, they hope that you're sort of further along in the legislative and regulatory process and would include draft or proposed legislation or regulations that may be working its way through the state process. So final plans, Jeremy covered this, so I'm not going to really discuss this any further. We can get into more of this in Q&A if people are interested in talking about it. I do want to touch on enforcement of state plans because this is a major difference between the final rule and the proposal. So we'll just take it with three groups that have potentially enforcement authority. So a state can enforce an EGU emission standard. So that would be a state taking a direct enforcement action against an EGU that's in violation of its emission standard. That's typical. States have this authority, generally, so this is nothing unusual there. States will also have enforcement authority against state measures programs. So these are these programs that are, being undertaken as part of a state plan by non-EGU actors, and states are going to be the only entity that can enforce against those state measures. EPA can potentially enforce against EGUs. That would be for violation of a standard, as well as for EGU providing, false statements, for example, or failing to file reports. And again, there's nothing unusual about that. That's typical for any Clean Air Act rule. EPA can take action against the emitter itself. And then there's citizen suits. Citizen suits are a critical component of Clean Air Act programs. And so citizens will be able to enforce against EGU emission standards, but they will not be able to enforce state measures. And the reason for that is that if a state measure, if the state measure program is not working, as Jeremy mentioned, there is this sort of backstop that then goes into effect. And so that would be a federally enforceable backstop, and that backstop would also be able to be enforced by citizens groups. But the state measure is not enforceable by citizen groups. This final rule includes this sort of five-part framework that is pretty typical, again, of EPA rules, and that is every emission standard and every state measure must have these five attributes: quantifiable, non-duplicative, permanent, verifiable, and enforceable. An emission standard, which is in an EGU's permit, sort of by definition, I think, meets these five attributes. Where it gets more complicated is with state measures. So we had spent some time looking at how, a state energy efficiency program might meet
these 5 components, and that's where it can get a little bit trickier, particularly on what it means for a state program to be enforceable. There's the definition up there on the screen. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. You know, we've done some thinking about this at the Environmental Policy Initiative. At this point, you know, these definitions, again, they apply to state measures. They don't apply, as far as I can tell, to entities that are generating ERCs. ERCs have to be quantifiable. So if you're doing an energy efficiency project and you're generating ERCs, your project has to be quantifiable and it has to be verifiable by an independent verifier. But it doesn't have to be enforceable under state law. If you don't generate those ERCs, then you just don't get them and you don't get to, you know, then sell them in the market, but there's no legal action that can be taken against you. Finally, the proposed federal plan. So there's been, you know, some talk about certain states just simply not wanting to participate in this program. And so what the result of that would be, if they don't make any filings with EPA, EPA will then promulgate a federal plan. This is pretty clearly authorized by Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. I don't think there's a lot of debate on that. At this point, EPA has released 2 different types of federal plans. There is a mass-based trading plan and a rate-based trading plan. EPA, I suspect, will finalize both of them as model rules for states to potentially use in their plans, but will pick one that they will use for the federal plan. So the final federal plan will either be mass or rate, and I suppose EPA will be taking comments on that over the next you know, several months and finalizing it next summer. There is some precedent for EPA using a mass-based trading program under Section 111D. That's the Clean Air Mercury Rule, which was promulgated in 2005. It was never implemented because it was overturned by the courts, but not by the DC Circuit, but not because of the mass-based trading program. It was for procedural reasons, pretty boring technical legal stuff. But you know, this is a proposal that was put forth by the EPA, that was finalized by the EPA. Environmental groups didn't like it because they didn't like the idea of being able to trade mercury, but carbon dioxide is a different type of pollutant. You don't have these you know, issues with sort of pollution hotspots that you have with mercury. And so, you know, just wanted to point out that, you know, you might hear some discussion about how this is sort of an unprecedented step or something that EPA is doing by putting states in a cap-and-trade program. But no, it's happened before in 2005. It was just never actually implemented. So I think with that, turn it back over for question and answers.
Thank you, and thanks so much to both of you for your presentations. That was really terrific. I can't tell you how helpful that was to me and hopefully to all of the people on the line as well. I'm going to mention a few things here, and then we'll turn it right over to questions. We have been receiving a lot of questions on the webinar at synapse-energy.com email, and please keep sending them in. Before I dive into the questions, just a couple things. I've had a number of people write and ask, are we going to make the slides available? Yes, we will. The slides will go out via email to the people on this call, and will also be posted up on the Synapse website sometime this afternoon. So yes, the slides will be available to you. A couple things. Thanks for changing the slide there. I've got a list of resources here for you that you can see right now, and will also be coming along with the slides. Some of these are really great resources that were written by Synapse that have to do with the proposed rule, but still have a lot of value now. The last 2 items on this list are blog posts on the Synapse blog. One from Monday by Jeremy that goes into compliance options, very helpful. And one written by Pat Knight and myself, posted yesterday. That's the 8 things you need to know about the Clean Power Plan. Again, these are some short pieces that can be helpful to you. And also wanted you to be aware of Synapse's modeling capabilities with regard to the Clean Power Plan. A lot of the people on the call have used Synapse for modeling before, and you've also seen the results of our modeling projects in reports and policy briefs. You can take a look at this or the information on our website to learn more about what we have teed up, our capabilities to provide modeling services with regards to Clean Power Plan. And then finally, as a piece of information, this webinar is part of a weekly series of webinars going forward. A few of these dates might change or move around a little bit. The one for next week is pretty solid, though. That's on August 11th. I think at 2 o'clock, and we'll be setting out an announcement for that. In that, we're going to be talking about emissions displacement, which sounds like a pretty technical topic. It is. We're going to try to do our best to do a non-technical treatment of it. Emissions displacement is important in the final rule, and come and join us next Tuesday and learn why and how. You can see a list of webinars up on our website. We'll be updating those periodically so you get the most accurate information, and also sending out announcements for each webinar. So please join us. Okay, I'm going to dive into questions, and I think by now, from the number of questions I've got, that everybody knows where to send your questions, I'm guessing. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that were questions of mine, and also I've been reading these questions as they come in as best I can, and other people have been asking too. So here's some questions asked by several people. Let me turn this so it's facing you and me. Okay. Here's my first question. So I think that most of the people on the call, like me, heard the President on Monday say that the final rule was a little bit more stringent than the proposed rule, and he's giving the figure that's that comparison to 2005, said 32% instead of 30%. Jeremy, we'll start with you on this. Ari might have something to contribute to. He's shaking his head no. Help us understand. Is it more stringent? Is it less stringent? I don't get it.
Yeah, that's a good question, Liz. We've just started looking into the numbers now, and one of the problems with trying to make this a definitive response, it seems like it would be an actually pretty easy response, is that in the initial proposal, EPA was faced with criticism that several states had unusual years in 2012, and so they made some adjustments to the baseline. States in particular like Washington, Oregon that had odd hydro years, or other states that had key units that were out of commission for that particular year but were otherwise expected to be back in commission. And EPA actually makes explicit state-by-state adjustments into 2012. So depending on what you're using as your baseline and what you're using as the final target, those numbers might swing around a little bit in terms of the overall percentage. But as far as we can tell, looking at the first initial cut, this actually looks like it's a slightly less stringent rule nationwide. So I'm not entirely sure I can get square with EPA's press on that.
Okay, but maybe more coming on this topic as we develop our modeling and learn more. We're watching this one as well and trying to figure it out. Here's my next question, which again, we've had several other people asking. Can you help us understand the ERCs a little bit better? What's the difference between an ERC and a REC? Can I generate 1 megawatt hour and it could both have an attribute of being a REC and an ERC? Can I sell it once? Can I sell it twice? Tell me how to use my RECs and my ERCs.
Yeah, so first of all, I think this is an interesting policy question, because if you have a renewable generator that's let's say selling RECs under a long-term agreement with a distribution company that needs them to meet a renewable portfolio standard, do you want that same generator to also be able to sell, now an ERC to a different entity? And so we're not really generating any new renewable energy from all this. We've just sort of created a new piece of paper. That aside, EPA, sort of mentions in the preamble that RECs are defined by state law, and so it's not a uniform definition. It can vary across states, and it's possible that some states sort of define REC in a way that gives the holder an exclusive right
to claim, the environmental attributes from that amount of energy. So in other words, when you buy a REC representing 1 megawatt hour, you are the only person who can say, I have 1 megawatt of clean renewable energy. So that might mean that that entity cannot generate both. So it's a state-by-state issue, and it's important to check the laws and then think about what's the policy that we're trying to, what's the goal we're trying to achieve here, and then see if your definitions are consistent with those goals.
And I believe I remember seeing language where EPA basically acknowledges that there will be some legal complications in states and says you might want to get this figured out on your state-by-state basis.
Yeah, okay, follow-up question then. How do I sort out my ERCs from my ton allowances? I know you've said this once, give me one more time. So what is the difference? Can I sell one? Can I sell the other? If I'm selling ERCs, can I also sell tons?
So you're either selling ERCs or you're selling tons. EPA is pretty explicit that you're choosing rate or mass for your state. Your state cannot be subdivided into rate and mass entities. If you're in a rate-based state, you have the ability to generate and then presumably sell ERCs, and you can use ERCs for what I think of as effectively diluting your denominator. Or diluting your rate. So if I'm a coal generator and I just can't get down to EPA's required rate, but that's my permit, EPA allows me to use those ERCs to stick on the denominator and dilute my rate and make me a cleaner generator. So I'm buying those attributes from somebody else for the purposes of my rate. But that's only if I'm in a rate-based state. If I'm in a mass-based state, I'm not doing that. I don't have ERCs available to me. ERCs don't make a difference to me, and I'm not generating ERCs under almost all circumstances. Very few circumstances that you'd expect generators in mass-based states to be generating or using ERCs. And in those states, if they have a mass-based trading system that allows them, like RGGI or California, then you'd expect those states to have mass-based allowance trading.
Okay. And since all of the compliance is at the EGU now, if I'm understanding this correctly, can I think of these as offsets?
Well, I would clarify that I don't think, not quite all the compliance, because there is this state measures approach,
yes.
Where you can put, again, it can only be used in mass-based states, and you can have certain, requirements being done by non-EGUs.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm an EGU, I can think of this as a layperson who may have some policy experience with this, think of it as an offset, that I'm buying an offset.
From ERCs?
Yes.
Yeah, that's probably not an unreasonable way to think about them.
It may be more familiar to some people.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's a question coming in from the email. What happened to the emissions from oil and gas-fired CTs in the final rule? Are they exempt?
I believe that CTs disappeared off the covered sources list, and that we've been left with oil and gas fossil steam, and we've been left with natural gas combined cycle units. So they are neither covered nor eligible to receive nor produce, well, particularly produce ERCs, but they're not within the subcategorization.
Okay.
And Ari will correct me in a couple minutes if I'm wrong on that.
Okay, but I'm going to interrupt him. I think this question is going to be for him. Are you still thinking about what happened to the CTs?
Yeah, no.
We're not sure, but that's our best guess at the moment.
Got 1,500 pages to cover.
We're working on it. Here's another question, possibly for you, Ari. So is it the case that state regulations created for state plans will need to be completed and approved by the time the initial plan is committed? Is that the timing on it? If my state is actually creating a new regulation with regards to the plan, what's the timing there?
Yeah, so the initial submission is 2016, and then you can apply for the extension until 2018. I don't think it would be particularly unusual for states to be in the process of doing that when they submit their final plan. EPA can also issue sort of a conditional approval. This is an approval assuming you finalize these regulations that you've told us you can finalize. So I don't see the September 2018 date as sort of a hard deadline, but by that point, states should be well on their way.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. So Here's a question about EE, and I think that we've got a bunch of questions about EE. It's a new thing for everybody to understand. So with the EE savings, if they're developed if you have EE savings that are developed in one state, how will they be kind of scored and receive credit if the emissions reductions occur in one state, occur in a different state? So EE occurs in one state, emissions reduction occurs in another state. Maybe we want to sell it to a third state. I don't know. How do you work that out?
Boy, Liz, what a loaded question here. So Liz is getting right into the core of what's going to probably be our next webinar on displacement and this really tricky issue that a lot of parties have been struggling with for a while. Of when I do energy efficiency in my state, it actually displaces resources in your state and your state. And it doesn't necessarily jibe that I'm the one who receives the credits for doing so. I think what EPA has come to a conclusion on this one says, if we're going to have rate-based compliance, let's just go with the simple case of rate-based compliance across the board. In that case, it sort of doesn't matter whether the reductions occur in my state or your state, as long as we're accomplishing the energy efficiency that we're charged to accomplish. It's going to be reducing resources somewhere on the grid, and whether it's my energy efficiency or your energy efficiency or my resources or your resources doesn't really make all that much of a difference. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is where we have a rate mass seam or boundary, and we start getting my energy efficiency in my rate-based state starts displacing your mass-based generators in your mass-based state, and as of yet I haven't seen a solution for that in this particular final rule. So I think that's just a form of uncertainty that we're going to have to be living with.
And I would just add that the role of energy efficiency is a bit different than the proposal. So if you're in a rate-based state, energy efficiency, the role of energy efficiency is to generate ERCs, to generate ERCs. And so, you know, you're basically then using those, the EGUs are basically then using those credits, as Jeremy mentioned, to reduce, you know, to dilute their denominator. In a mass-based state, you could have energy efficiency as sort of part of this state measures approach. So you do still potentially have some of these cross-border issues, but I just want to keep in mind that it's different from the proposal now, and that we're in the rate-based states, we're using it just to generate credits. We don't have to necessarily, you know, see the output in that rate-based state go down.
But you could end up with a interesting circumstance where, due to the structure of the grid, my renewable energy projects that I'm putting on in my state almost exclusively cause reductions in your mass-based state, and I'm getting ERCs for that, and you're also getting mass-based reductions for that. And hopefully there's going to be enough uniformity over what states are choosing, and that's a fairly rare circumstance, that's going to be fairly insignificant. But certainly is an open question.
And I can't claim that we're going to have a definitive answer about it for next week, but this is a good advertisement for our webinar next week on Tuesday, August 11th, to come and join us. We're going to talk more about displacement and try to understand these issues a little bit better. All right, here's another question. Let's say I'm a state, I'm going to be Washington, and I have a PPA for wind with Wyoming. Who owns the ERCs or ton allowances? And yeah, who owns them? Who can sell them? How does that work?
You know, I would say a lot of this it's relying on contracts. So I mean, you know, the way the plan works is that the EGUs ultimately are going to be the ones that need to hold the ERC. So if there's a generator in Washington that buys an ERC from a wind facility in Wyoming, then it's that generator that gets to take credit for it because it's the owner of that ERC. But I mean, you know, a lot of these contracts are, you know, usually often they're for energy and for RECs, and so now people may have to go back and figure out where does an ERC play into this contract. I think certainly going forward for new contracts, people are going to, I'm sure, be explicitly including ERCs in their contracts, but you know, renewable energy generation that came online in 2013, 14, and 15, and I'm sure there are already contracts for things coming online in 16. So this will give lawyers a lot of opportunities to go back and look at some contracts, I think.
For sure.
I wanted to actually go back to a question that we were raising earlier that had a little uncertainty in terms of what happened to simple cycle combustion turbines, and verify that, in fact, simple cycle combustion turbines, along with some forms of EGU and a couple of other types of generators, are excluded as affected sources. So they are not part of this rule.
Thank you for that multitasking and figuring that out for us. So here's another question, different topic. Can you help us understand a little bit better, under the mass-based compliance options, I, as a state, can choose to just look at existing units for my compliance or existing and new together. I've got two different options there. Try to explain it to us in terms of why would I want to do one instead of the other?
Under a mass-based world? Under your mass-based world, you've got two different types of targets. So very simply, the world that most electricity planners are used to is one in which, or at least have been thinking about for a while, is one in which you have mass-based targets applied to pretty much all units across the board. So if you're generating CO2, you have some limit applied to you, and everyone is applicable under that trading system. That's effectively the way that RGGI and California's CO2-based trading system work, and others that have been proposed. And so there's an attractive option looking at the mass-based targets that include both new and affected units. It keeps things really simple, and EPA's criteria for the level of rigor that they require to show that you're not leaking is much less stringent. EPA says if you're just going to cover the whole deal, then we're happy with them. If you're going to cover existing sources only, it actually gives you a slightly more stringent target, but it means that you can more or less ignore what's happening to your new units. EPA wants you to make sure that you've got those new units covered to some extent so that you're not leaking into them. But it's got a slightly more complicated mechanism, but it, I guess, to some extent prevents EPA from having jurisdiction in an area that you otherwise might not want them to have premature jurisdiction. I don't know if you have a better way of thinking about it.
So it sounds from what you said that there really could be legitimate reasons that a state would choose one over the other, and that both are viable?
Both are certainly viable. I think if I were to guess, I would guess that most states would choose to also use the new source complement as well, just because it's so much more in line with the way that we think about the system, and it reduces their obligations in terms of reporting requirements and plan requirements. But I guess we'll see how that shakes out.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So, Jeremy, this is another one for you. You had shown us a series of slides with maps, and the last one gave us a comparison of proposed to final. In that, there were some states that were actually having much more stringent treatment under the final rule. Why is that? Is there sort of a why to that or a pattern to it? Can you explain that to us?
I'm sure there is a why to it, and I've got a feeling, I've got the map up on the screen again. And I'm sure that if we were to look into the way that the math actually shakes out, that we could figure out why those states ended up with a slightly more stringent target. But at this point, I don't have a particularly good answer for you in terms of exactly why it happened in each state. Recall that the fundamental math that underlies the structure of Besser in the proposal is different than the math that underlies Besser in the final, recognizing that the definition of Besser hasn't changed all that much, but its application has.
Okay. This is a question about, oh, did you want to go ahead?
Just, looking at the map, I mean, it seems like some of these states that are in the red are much more coal-heavy and less NGCC-heavy, but that seems to be maybe a factor, but, I guess you'd have to do all the analysis.
Yeah. This is a question about baseload and non-baseload plants. What's the determination for whether a new natural gas plant is going to be baseload or non-baseload? And for non-base load, is there any binding requirement beyond just setting the natural gas? Are there any binding requirements? There seems to be
a 111B question?
It is kind of a 111B question. I suppose the two things are related, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, there is a distinction in terms of what standard is going to apply, whether it's base load or non-base load. I have not had a chance to dive into that at this point, so sorry.
Stick to 111D for the moment?
Yeah. 111D. How will the plan deal with unbundled RECs? For instance, you have an Iowa wind project that sells output to a utility. The project keeps the RECs and sells outside of the state. Can the utility or state use this wind to show compliance? This is a new wind project, not old.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is just sort of like a policy kind of design question here. Like it seems to be that what EPA is looking for is holding that ERC instrument, that the EGU itself has to be the holder of that ERC, and so. The wind being located in your state, you may sort of, yeah, I don't know that's going to really.
Yeah, I think, as you said before,
you're a mass-based state and then you're dealing with ERCs, you're dealing with.
Right, and I think as you were describing before, where it goes really back to how that contract is laid out. So unless there's a provision that prevents the generator from otherwise separating out the environmental attributes from the REC, as exists in many states, and I don't know how it exists in Iowa, then presumably that ERC can be separately contracted. Yeah,
and I'm looking forward to, I'm sure people will be doing a lot of analysis on how this ERC market may develop, because, a lot of renewable energy projects, are built with long-term power purchase agreements in place, and often it's load-serving entities that, have to serve customers, so they need the energy, and they also need the REC so they can demonstrate compliance with the renewable obligation. But now you have these EGUs that don't need the energy, and so how is that market going to shake out now? I think is going to be interesting to see.
Right, and I think it'll be similarly curious for the qualified facilities structures under PURPA. All of those rooftop solar programs and other small renewable energy programs that are required by PURPA to be purchased by utilities. Those new ones coming online, or even some of the existing ones that already have long-term contracts in place, are those contracts going to get rewritten to also now include ERCs? Are they going to get repriced to include ERCs? It's going to be an interesting piece that's panning out. And sort of a similar question of if you're signing a contract today, that's going to be a 20-year contract. Do you want to include ERCs in that contract today, or do you want to come back and revisit that in 2022?
Yeah, and on the PURPA piece, there have been a couple of court decisions about, PURPA agreements that didn't contemplate RECs, and then there was disputes about who owns the RECs. Is it the utility? Is it the generator who can then sell them to somewhere else? So I don't know if people are interested in following up separately on that. Send me an email. I'd be happy to talk about that issue with you more.
Great. Can you switch us over to slide 16? We've got a couple of different questions about that here. So this gives the different compliance pathways, R123 and 1234. So on R2, and that's the state CO2 emissions rate, what's the each in this slide? It's a kind of question about the wording on the slide, help people understand. Does each power plan must meet the single state average, or in aggregate the plans to? That's each plant has that obligation. It must meet the state average.
That's right. And so if we go back to, again, recalling that almost for all of these plans that are on here, for R1, R2, R3, M1, and M2, these are what EPA is considering emission standard approaches, which means that there is a permitted rate or a permitted something at the EGU. These EGUs now hold a new permit for CO2 emissions or CO2 rate emissions. And what EPA is demanding under R2 here is that if you're going down that pathway, each and every affected EGU holds exactly the same emissions rate in its permit, and that will be the state's average emissions rate as defined by the final rule.
So they have to meet that emissions rate, but of course they can do that in part by purchasing ERC.
That's right. And for many EGUs, they would not be able to meet that emissions rate without the purchasing of ERCs.
Which will then affect how, in markets, it'll affect how they're bidding into the market. And
absolutely. And right, it will affect what they're able to do, both for purchasing those ERCs, how many ERCs they need to hold in their system. It's going to get sort of interesting to make sure that you're holding enough ERCs at the end of the day when you get to true up. And notably, those states that are going under R2, they can have trading, possibly they can have rate-based trading within their state, but they can't have rate-based trading outside of their state because states don't have similar targets. So EPA has said no rate-based trading for R2s, but you can do rate-based trading for R1s here as an interstate rate-based trading, which is sort of a separate entity from ERCs.
Right, okay. Another question we have is, could you just one more time tell us the difference between R1 and R3?
Yeah. So R1 is where we have each unit, again, has a specific subcategorized CO2 emissions rate, and it is uniform across the board, across the U.S. If you're pursuing R1 and you're a coal-fired unit, you have a specific stepped CO2 emissions rate that you must hit on that you must hit. If EPA has set that number, it's solid. Same thing if you're a natural gas combined cycle unit, you have a particular number that EPA has put forward. R3 differs in that you can choose as a state what each individual EGU's rate target will be and write it into the permit separately. So I, as a coal unit, can lobby for a particular rate, and you, as a gas unit, can lobby for a completely different rate. But if we go that route, it means that, A, those natural gas units, I think, cannot generate ERCs in the same way that they can under the other two mechanisms. But more specifically, the state needs to provide a performance demonstration to EPA showing that they're going to specifically hit those state average emissions rates when it really comes down to it. Because, you know, if I've got a whole bunch of randomly permitted units, EPA would have no way of knowing that I'm going to actually be able to hit the targets that I'm saying I'm going to hit.
And a performance demonstration is?
A performance demonstration is effectively, although EPA doesn't call it a model, you can think of it as a long-term planning model that would be done by a state. EPA appears to be open to non-modeling approaches as well, but effectively it's a long-term plan that says, based on the programs that we're expecting to do, the things that we expect to get for our generators, the generation that these generators are going to produce, overall they're going to produce about this much, which will give us a state average emissions rate that looks like this each and every year, and that's better than EPA's target, so we're fine.
So you're documenting to EPA, whether through modeling or maybe through some other way that I'm not clear on, that you're documenting that you can in fact hit your targets.
Yes.
Using the program that you've put together.
Not only can, but you are likely to.
Yes.
Right.
That's better yet. Yeah.
Can I ask a question on that? In that sort of modeling demonstration, or rather in an R3 plan in particular, you can include things like retirements, right? And that can be part of your demonstration.
Yeah. Although I don't know in a rate-based demonstration whether to what extent your retirements that are not committed can form a part of a adequate demonstration. And EPA is a little bit fuzzy on this. They say it needs to be replicable and reliable, but it doesn't really go beyond that. So I think there's a little bit of openness in terms of what EPA might consider replicable and reliable.
Great. Here, one question for each of you. So Jeremy, where does the load growth come in? Where do we see growth in demand with the mass-based targets? How does that work?
Sure. So you see load growth very specifically in the new unit complement. And that's really the only place that you see it. So if you recall, back in proposal land, states had the option of creating their own mass-based targets. And there was this big open question that the way that you might create your own mass-based target was by multiplying your state rate by your expected load. And so if states could define their own future load, there was a huge incentive to game if you were looking for a less stringent target. Happily, well, I think at least to some parties, happily, EPA has done away with that level of flexibility and has defined mass targets for your existing units. But where load growth comes in is specifically for your new units under a new source complement. So EPA has, I think, actually used EIA forecasts and put in load growth for individual states and multiply that out by what they expect new gas units will emit at in order to be able to fill that gap, and that's the new source complement that's available to each state.
Great. And this one, I think, is for you, Ari. What are the points of liability for the state? If a state goes with a standards plan and the EGUs don't comply, is the state liable? And if a state integrates new and existing under the same cap, can it get sued for unfairly treating new and existing plans the same, despite EPA explaining it's okay, stating that it's okay? When and how is the state liable?
So on the state measures issue, the state is not going to be liable under federal law. Whether there might be some, mechanism for a state program under state law, whether there could be some liability, it would have to be a state law issue. So it wouldn't have to do with the fact that it's in the plan. So what really the state's role is here is to, submit a plan and then submit, subsequent reports each interim period. There is not any liability for the state. So the second question had to do with, I think, differential treatment of new and existing sources. I'm not sure what the legal problem might be there.
If I recall correctly, I remember running into language, and again, this is a quick little piece, where EPA said that under an emission standard approach, they didn't have the jurisdiction at this point to be able to put in the mass-based target requirement for new sources, and so that would have to be done under state jurisdiction.
Okay.
So even under a total mass-based trading system that included new and existing sources under an emission standard approach, existing sources would be regulated under federal jurisdiction, and new sources under that mass-based program would have a state jurisdiction. And so there actually was a separation of jurisdiction. But I don't know if I'm absolutely
right.
It
seems that if you
put,
if you put the existing units in your plan under a mass program, that would put it under the purview of EPA, and EPA would certainly have enforcement authority under those units as well. So I guess I'll have to look at that. I'm not sure exactly what the questioner is getting at. So.
Okay. Jeremy, can you remind us what leakage is? And then the question here is the M3 of the compliance pathways, is M3 the only one where a leakage demonstration is required?
Fine question. So leakage can take effectively two forms. One form of leakage that we potentially run into is where you have existing units that generate less, but new units pick up the slack, and you effectively leak your CO2 emissions target from your existing units to your new units. So while it looks like your existing units are doing so much better, your new units are doing so much worse that you've effectively not had the regulatory outcome that you were looking for. So that's one form of leakage. Another form of leakage is when geographic leakage, when one state does something and another state picks up the slack for it or ends up picking up the slack for it. And that's something that might fall more akin to a double counting question than necessarily leakage. But EPA addresses specifically leakage with regards to existing sources leaking over to new sources. And specifically, they target M1 and M3, the cases in which you have a state measures plan or a emission standard plan, in reverse order, where you have an emission standard plan under M1 and a state measures plan under M3 that address only your existing units. They want to make sure that you've got a system in place that's going to prevent your new units from so much picking up the slack that you lose any of the benefits.
Great. Can you switch us over to slide 18, please? Got a couple questions for you about what qualifies for ERC. So first, are you on the right one? It says, yeah, great. First, just to help me out, what was the timing on this? Does it have to be new? Does it have to be new resources or any resources?
ERCs can be issued to new resources built after 2013 or after.
So everything on this list we should think of has to be built 2013 or after.
Everything on this list is 2013 or after.
Okay.
Well, in the nuclear, it would be if there's an uprate after 2013 or if there's a new nuclear plant.
Okay. Right. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. So, right, uprates also count.
And I
guess uprates account for anything, not just nuclear.
So,
and an uprate is, for people, an uprate of
it's increasing the capacity, the output of the plant. Yeah.
And EPA has some fairly strict criteria for that. They say if you take your hydro unit, for example, and you add another turbine, and that uprates you by 10%, then you only get ERC credit for that 10% that you've uprated.
Okay. And then for hydro, is that any hydro? In the unlikely event that we had a new gigantic hydro project in the United States, would that be included? Is it just little hydro projects? Is there any limit there?
I'm not sure that there was any explicit limit in the rule.
So I'm just new.
I think that's the big qualification.
Okay.
And grid connected.
And grid connected.
And grid connected.
New and grid connected is what we're looking for. All right. You had said if you have an NGCC unit that produces below EPA NGCC baseline, below its emissions rate, that unit qualifies for tradable ERC. But it's not on your ERC list here.
It is on my ERC list here. It's on slide 17.
Slide 17.
And so...
Did we go back one? Good.
Yeah, we did. So there's this funky category that's going to take a little bit of getting used to overall, which is units that produce below the either subcategory, I believe it's actually just below the subcategory rate of emissions. I have to admit, I don't remember whether it also applies to whether you produce below your state's target as well. But for those units that produce at a level below their subcategory target rate, for the extent that they produce below that rate, they can produce ERCs. So let's say my target rate, I just don't remember my target rates offhand.
771? Well, that's the 2030 number, though. It's sort of...
but let's say in a particular year it's close to 800 pounds per megawatt hour, and I managed to get my super efficient unit producing at 700 pounds per megawatt hour. I can take 7/8 of a ERC per megawatt hour that I produce for that natural gas generator. And that can only be used to offset fossil generators. It cannot be used to offset other natural gas generators, confusingly enough. So it's sort of like its own little separate ERC attribute. Then, it's going to get even worse, right? There's this incremental NGC generation above baseline, which says for natural gas generators, which have increased their output above their baseline expectations from EPA, they can document the amount that they're now outputting, and there's also an adjustment of how much they're different from their expected rate, and taking those two fractions together and multiplying by the differential of the amount of output that it puts out now versus what it used to put out, you can generate some ERCs off of that too. And again, those can only be used for fossil units. So,
I can't wait for the T-shirt that has the formula.
Really complicated. Yeah, can we get a bumper sticker on that?
And interestingly enough, the EPA is actually allowing states to come up with their own formulation as to how that works. But they say, go ahead and take a look at our model rule. You might as well adopt what we have in our model rule. And out in model rule, they have this 3-page formulation for how you might think about that.
Wow.
I don't envy the person who's trying to get that figured out.
No. All right. Thank you. Okay. Let's imagine a future ERC market for a moment. Obviously, we don't know yet. Maybe you've read something in the rule, or you can just look forward for us. Do you think that non-state entities, not states and not generators, will be able to purchase RECs and use them as ERCs, and use them as offset mechanisms, or use them, just retire them? You know, I'm thinking of I'm a university, or I'm an environmental NGO. Do you think I'll be able to go into that market and purchase them sort of for a different purpose? Have you read anything in the rule on this?
I don't think anything would restrict that in the rule. I think this is a matter of states defining ERCs just as states now define RECs. I mean, RECs are already used for those purposes, but I suppose, ERCs potentially include, or, could include energy efficiency projects, which I guess there is no, there are not big markets for those sorts of credits. And so, I suppose there's a potential for that.
Oh, I think even better, and because it's going to be such a, if we end up with a large number of states that are going in this ERC direction, and because so many ERCs will then be in circulation if we have those large number of states, I imagine there's going to be a lot of money caught up in the ERC market overall. So I'm sure we'll have lots of parties that are trading outside of the electric sector directly, have ERC derivatives.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly the case with the REC market now that there are all sorts of players in the market for RECs that are not just meeting RPS compliance. Right? So how about user-owned solar? I think what's meant here is behind the meter. How's that going to be treated? Is it different from utility solar? Any thoughts?
As far as I can tell, if the state sets up the guideline and can show through monitoring and verification that those rooftop solar programs produce megawatt hours that are grid connected, those produce applicable ERCs. So it does rely on the state setting up the mechanism to be able to count those ERCs, but presuming that states have the wherewithal to do so, then they're in.
So just like today, if I have solar panels on my roof, I could be generating and selling SRECs.
Just like if you had solar panels today and you were starting to generate SRECs, yes. However, if you built your solar panels in 2012, you're probably out of luck.
Fair enough, yeah. My current solar panels not so good. The ones I built 2013 and future, yeah. Okay. Let's see. Give me a second here. Has EPA said anything about their role in running the rate-based trading system, or maybe any of the trading systems? But this question is about the rate-based trading system, like a central system. Are they going to create and run a system? Do they want states to do that?
I think EPA's raised the possibility of it, but has not committed to anything, is my understanding of sort of tracking ERCs and trading ERCs. I don't think the rule is specific on how that's going to work.
Nothing together.
Okay, nuclear. This question is asking if you're surprised by the difference in the way nuclear is treated, the elimination of that sort of credit system for the existing nuclear. There's been a lot of changes in terms of how both existing and new nuclear are treated. Can either of you speak to that? It's really different. Maybe, Ari, why? What happened? You had kind of given us the proposed to new in terms of the why legally. What's the why here?
Well, I think that the big difference from my perspective is that it's not used in the goal-setting methodology. It's not part of BESR. So I think Georgia and South Carolina and Tennessee are pretty excited about that. Legally, I'm not sure. I can't recall a specific legal explanation for EPA on that, but I could go back and check. It could be having to do, the statute does require that EPA consider cost when it sets the best system of emission reduction. Certainly, new nuclear is looking like it may be an expensive option, so maybe that's why it's not included in the best system emission reduction, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I've got a feeling that the calculation that EPA had for looking at existing nuclear relicensure and then trying to parse that amongst the states in a moderately equitable sort of way was probably vulnerable. And so I'm not terribly surprised that that was nixed overall. And overall, I've got a feeling that EPA probably felt they had their hands tied when it came down to excluding nuclear as a low emissions resource. But it does leave us in this interesting position that even if other states at this point might be on the edge one way or the other about whether they're going to go mass-based or rate-based, you can certainly see South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee having a strong impetus to want to make sure their nuclear units can generate significant ERCs into the market.
I will just add that I'm noticing in the proposal that EPA does say in the final rule, EPA notes that in the proposal there was some mechanism for preserving existing nuclear generation, and EPA decided that it was inappropriate to be including a mechanism that's not going to actually reduce CO2 emissions from where they currently are, but they don't really give too much more beyond that.
Yeah. About 2012 as a base year, so there were a lot of comments on that to EPA. They stuck with 2012. They did adjust it, however. Are you surprised to see them stick with 2012? Do you think it matters? Do you know anything about the adjustments to 2012?
Yeah, so EPA had a couple of critiques that they had received on 2012, and I think the two most notable ones were that 2012 was an unusual year from a hydro perspective, and some states asked if they could have some flexibility in choosing a different year. And a couple of states noted that they had large fossil units that were out for large portions of that year, and that was really changing their rate fairly significantly, and asked for some exceptions. So what EPA did here is they looked back at 2011 and 2010 as well, and they looked into those years and they thought about using those, and they ultimately rejected it and said, we're going to stick with 2012 because we think 2012 actually is decently representative of what we want. We have sufficient data for it. We have a comprehensive information for it. We understand that year pretty well, and we're going to go ahead and make one-off adjustments in places where it's necessary. So in hydro-heavy states, they actually made some adjustments to increase the amount of generation from units to account for the fact that that was otherwise a high hydro year that would have displaced a large amount of fossil. And for units that had been specifically out, they went through and adjusted those to a more typical year. So there's 2012, and then there's sort of 2012 normalized.
Right. Mm-hmm. Great. Another question about leakage. There seem to be two kinds of leakages, right? There's sort of a leakage out of state that we typically think of as a question with RGGI, for example. Is there leakage out of state? There's also the idea of leakage between existing and new sources. So can you explain a little bit more about the latter? How should we understand that? That's the demonstration that EPA is looking for, right? Or is it both? Just a little bit more on the leakage issue.
Yeah, and where the leakage really comes into play is, again, that concern that existing units would ramp down their generation and new units would ramp up. And you can imagine a circumstance in which a state or utility or merchant generator, let's go with a vertically integrated utility, has just built a brand new natural gas combined cycle unit today, right next to an existing one. And they're both equivalent resources, and they had every intent on running both of them going into the future. And they said, well, we now have this rule that's going to require us to reduce generation. We're just going to simply turn off this old one and run the new one instead. Well, you're still getting some emissions reductions from that, but it's not really what EPA was looking for. Now let's go even worse. And a utility says, well, we actually have an incentive to build a whole bunch of new natural gas units because, well, we like building natural gas units. We know how to operate them. They're easy enough. They're not renewable energy. And we're just going to sprinkle them all over the landscape and just run our new natural gas units instead of running our old natural gas units. From a CO2 emissions perspective, you've accomplished nothing, and EPA is concerned about that. So from a mass-based perspective, and again, this really comes into play in the mass-based world, one of the things that they've set up is this interesting question of the allocation of permits. So EPA says we don't really have an opinion on the allocation of permits to units. And what I mean by allocation here is when we have a mass-based trading program, units need to somehow or another not only have a target that they need to hit, but they need to know how many, well, they need to have a particular target that they're going to hit, and they need to know what it is that they need to do in order to be able to get that target. And so EPA says, well, you could create a system in which we actually have a rolling reallocation of targets to units every year based on how much they generated the year before. So the more you generate, the more generous your requirement is every year. And EPA's explanation for that is that that allows them to be confident that existing units have an impetus to generate as much as they can. And so their hope is that units that have an impetus to generate as much as they can that are existing won't be substituted for by new units. I'm not entirely sure if that math ultimately works out in the long run, but they're hoping to try to circumvent that with that allocation scheme.
Okay, that's helpful. This is a question about double counting renewables in the compliance formula or the target formula. So it looks like the renewable energy is included in computing the emissions rates for steam and NGCs. Does that double count the emission reduction from renewables in the rate option?
So the renewables, so that slide that I think shows the target between natural gas and fossil steam both includes renewable energy in the denominator. And this is not necessarily entirely clear because we're trying to put it into a simplified slide here, but really what this has done is it's renewable generation divided pro rata between fossil steam and natural gas combined cycle units. So if their expectation is from the potential studies that they've conducted, or NREL's conducted in this case, to come up with that renewable generation, that you'll have 2 terawatt-hours worth of renewable generation, then that gets divided in a particular interconnect between the fossil steam side and the natural gas side. And so that renewable energy generation hopefully is not counted twice.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask you a couple of things. Which one of these two options in the rule you like better? Maybe you'll also know which one EPA seems to be pushing a little bit more. You could distinguish between those two things for both of you. Rate versus mass-based compliance. Do you feel like one or the other is better or worse? Do you think that EPA is trying to encourage states to use one or the other?
Well, you know, a lot of the studies that I've seen over the past year, and granted it was looking at the proposal, not the final rule, seem to suggest that mass was the less expensive compliance option. As someone who, you know, I'm a lawyer, and so I focus on sort of the compliance aspect of thing. I sort of liked rate because it was more complicated, but that's just sort of, you know, it made it more interesting for me, even if it was more expensive for everybody else. But so that's my take on it. You know, in terms of where EPA seems to be pushing people, I get the sense that it is mass-based, but I can't, Jeremy, maybe you could figure out what exactly are the message, you know, how they're sending that message.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure I necessarily get an explicit message. I definitely get the message that EPA is being very explicit that mass is not only okay, it really, really is okay in the final rule. In the proposal, you could have argued that since targets were set on a rate basis and mass was sort of the back page of you can also translate to mass if you want to, you could have gotten the impression that mass was taking a backseat to rate, and it really does not take a backseat to rate in the final. Personally, I'm a fan of mass for exactly the same reason that Ari is a fan of rate, because it's so much less complicated. It can be measured at the stack. We know how to measure it. We know what the system means for electricity markets, and I think personally it allows a lot less manipulation in the system where you have so many fewer moving pieces. So I think there are just a lot of reasons to like mass overall, but it'll be interesting to see which states find an impetus towards rates and which ones find towards mass. Just
to stick up for rate for a second, it's important in the design of the rule, and you know, in the BESR, because that is typically how Section 111 standards are set. So I think it was important for EPA to set that rate, and I think it'll play a big role in its legal defense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, hopefully everyone will just comply with mass.
Same question, multi-state compliance versus single-state compliance. Is one better than the other? Does EPA think one is better than the other?
Well, EPA is really open now to this sort of hybrid option, which I guess is sort of a single-state plan, but with, you know, your trading ready. I don't remember exactly the term that EPA uses, and that seems like a simpler solution than a multi-state plan. And it seems like it achieves a lot of the same goals.
Right.
So with that in place, with the trading ready in place, do I have any reason to comply jointly with other states as a multi-state file a plan jointly to EPA?
And so I could only really find 2 reasons right now that you'd really want to go down a multi-state route. And one of those is if you want to do rate-based trading with another state, and this is, again, where we're trading tons per megawatt hour. It's a weird way of doing things, but it potentially has some attractive attributes to it. EPA demands that if you want to do interstate rate-based trading, you either need to use the uniform standard rate of emissions or you need to adopt the same emissions rate across the state. And so that requires a multi-state plan. And then the other option, or the other component of it is if different states have slightly different standards for ERCs and EPA has concerns about those being traded freely between each other, then states might want to think about multi-state plans to make sure that they're on the same page about the definition of ERCs.
Yeah. The third possibility is because you're already in RGGI, and so maybe you want to keep that going. And there's also like different ways to do a multi-state plan. You could do a multi-state plan that has sort of the common elements, but then you know, individual states may have subcomponents that are not common. That could have separate filings from each state. So there's other possibilities in there as well.
We've only got time for a few more questions, and I know that I haven't gotten to everybody's questions. Sorry about that. We did have quite a flood. Hopefully you heard some helpful information that answered your question. If not, we're always happy to hear your questions via email and can try to respond as best we can. You can find my email or Jeremy's on the Synapse website, and Ari's is pretty easy to find too up on his website. So, Sarah, when she sends around the slides and recording, can send those as well. So just a couple last questions, and then we're going to close up. You mentioned a couple things that are not eligible for ERCs. They don't seem to be included here. What do we do? What about storage, for example? And the effect of storage or maybe other technologies to improve system dispatch. They've got other attributes, but they don't seem to get credit here. Do you have any insight there?
Yeah, so you know, the two things that EPA, as far as I can tell, really just knocks right out and says not eligible are new stationary sources, and that sort of goes without saying. You know, we don't want our new stationary sources developing into the ERC market and playing the same leakage problem that we potentially have under mass-based. It's already complicated enough. Let's keep those units out of the system. They'll be regulated under 111D. But storage is its own funny little piece because EPA is actually quite apologetic about it. They say we really recognize that energy storage is a valuable component of making sure we can get renewable energy in the system. We like energy storage. We want to make sure that we can try to incentivize it going downstream, and sure, we hope that as we start getting more renewable energy, it gets incentivized through that structure. But it doesn't save energy unto itself. Energy storage actually uses energy. And so it's a high value proposition to have in the system to make sure we have system stability, but it doesn't reduce CO2 emissions unto itself, and EPA just could not find a way of getting it into the system.
Okay, I think we better stop there. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Ari, this was really terrific. We've had most of our listeners stay on through the entire question period. Thank you, everybody. Please go ahead and email us if you have more questions. We will be sending out the slides and the recording, and join us next Tuesday to talk about emissions displacement. We're going to sign off now.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.